Tonight on Nation to Nation, a commitment by Ottawa to close the First Nations housing gap by 2030 is unrealistic, says Canada's Auditor General.
At the end of 2023, 80% of the needs that had been identified a few years ago to close the gap are still unmet.
Karen Hogan's report on the First Nations and Inuit policing program made recommendations similar to those in the past audits.
And it's concerning that Public Safety Canada has agreed to all the recommendations for each one of the audits, yet there has been no changes made.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Auditor General Karen Hogan released two reports earlier this week, one on First Nations housing and the other on First Nations policing. Hogan gives the federal government a failing grade on both. The report says almost nothing has changed in the dire state of First Nations housing in the past 20 years, in spite of repeated promises from Ottawa. Well, in First Nations policing, Hogan says the RCMP is not meeting its commitments under the Community Tripartite Agreement. Ms. Hogan joins us today in our Ottawa studio. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Right. Now, I know you release all sorts of reports on government, and that's part of your job, but I noticed you were quite disheartened, I think, yesterday on releasing these two reports on First Nations policing and on housing. Could you maybe describe a little bit about why you felt that way?
Well, I think I categorize it as being, just discouraged at the fact that so much time and money has been invested, and we see very little change in the conditions of housing in First Nations communities. I think everyone across Canada deserves to live in a house that's safe and adequate for their needs. And this is the fourth time that my office has looked at housing, and that spans over 20 years. If you think about it, that's an entire generation who haven't really seen things improving, even though Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation invested in the last 5 years almost $4 billion in trying to repair and build new homes.
Now, of course, money is always an issue, and the federal government hasn't spent enough money addressing the issue. But aside from that, you mentioned some other things that you feel the federal government could be doing better in terms of just addressing this issue in housing.
I think when it comes to housing, it isn't just about having a new home or fixing some major repairs. Sometimes it's the day-to-day things that an individual has to deal with. And if you look at mold in housing, that's one of the areas that I think really concerns me. It's a long-standing health hazard in these communities. And Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation don't really know the magnitude of the problem. And in fact, in 2008, they put in place a strategy to manage mold, which was in response to a recommendation we had made from a previous audit. And we found that this time around that strategy is no longer being used. And neither entity could tell us why it wasn't being used. So, not only do they not know the magnitude of the problem, but there's just no plan in place to try and fix it.
Okay, and we had, about this 2030 commitment to address the gap the federal government has made. I did ask Minister Hajdu after you released your report if they are going to still meet this, and she confirmed they will. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, if we look at what was spent in the last 5 years, it's been about $4 billion, and at the end of 2023, 80% of the needs that had been identified a few years ago to close the gap are still unmet. So in my view, it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to meet that commitment. One of our findings was that the government hadn't put in place a plan to figure out how to fund how much this would cost. The Assembly of First Nations in 2021 estimated it would be $44 billion to close the gap by 2030. And then when there's no plan to know how you're going to fund that, it's a large sum of money, how are you going to fund that, and how are you going to support communities in order to be ready to deliver on some of the construction projects that are needed? In my view, it's unlikely that that gap will be closed unless there's a significant ramp up of effort or just a fundamentally different way to approach this going forward.
Now, I'd just like to move to First Nations policing for a minute, because you also released a report on that, of course. You noted that $13 million wasn't spent in the previous year on First Nations policing that was supposed to be by the federal government, and also that the RCMP has not been able to hire the number of officers that it's been funded for under the Community Tripartite Agreement. So what exactly is going on there?
I think here how I would categorize it is it start by telling you this is our second time actually looking at this program, the Indigenous and Inuit policing program. And again, this time around, we found that there were some critical shortcomings in how it was managed. So Public Safety Canada manages the program, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are the ones who provide the services. And if I would highlight three areas, I guess, around the critical shortcomings, one would be the funds going unspent. So in 2022-23, there's about $13 million that went unspent, and that's across the two entities. And that's concerning when it's a program that's meant to improve the security and safety of First Nations communities. And then, as you mentioned, the RCMP haven't been able to meet their commitments, and what we found is that only 38% of the detachments that serve these First Nations and Inuit communities could show us that their police officers were spending 100% of their time doing community-based proactive policing, and that's a requirement in the agreement. And I think the last thing I would highlight is really the lack of regular and consistent engagement with communities to understand their needs, to understand if they need more or if they need to tailor the program. When agreements auto-renew every 10 to 15 years, it's a really long time to wait to sit down and have an engagement and a conversation.
No, a lot of the, of course, you're talking about the community tripartite agreements. There's also the self-administered agreements that are very popular with First Nations that we talk to, that they really want to move toward this. Were you able to see how those programs are working in terms of spending, or were you just looking at the broader? No,
we looked at those two. Those are actually the two main kind of agreements that are found under the Indigenous and Inuit, or the First Nations and Inuit policing program. I think the difference between the two is to know that in one, a tripartite agreement is where the RCMP provides the policing services, and in the self-administered agreements is when there is an Indigenous or Inuit police force doing it. And so ultimately, that is really how you support self-determination, when you can take over the power and run the program yourself. And there's been lots of money given to this program in 2021, earmarked to expand the program and stabilize it. And what we found is that there was very little expansion. So very little communities added to tripartite, but then no communities transitioning from tripartite to self-administered. The money was used to stabilize and just meet the needs under existing agreements. And I think that shows how the needs are just not being met over time.
Now, just moving towards sort of your, being disheartened about, some of what government has done over the years in this on First Nations policing and housing, and you mentioned other things like water, things like that. The way the system works is you give your reports, and often this leads to public pressure on government to make changes. And of course, we're seeing that with the Arrive Can app. I think there probably will be some changes. There's a lot of interest. But what about First Nations issues? Are you worried that there isn't enough public concern or pressure out there to force the government to change, because they've been getting pretty bad report cards for a number of years now?
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, I'm not the first Auditor General to talk about the failures when it comes to commitments to Indigenous peoples. Sheila Fraser, at the end of her mandate, said that it was, unacceptable, I think is how she categorized it at the end of her 10 years. And then my predecessor, Mike Ferguson, 5 years later, said it was beyond unacceptable. And in my view, those strong words are just not driving the change that First Nations communities need to see. And that's why I think that the government needs to take a step back and realize that they need to fundamentally change the way they approach all of these programs, whether it be for safe drinking water, emergency preparedness, or in this case, housing and policing. That passive, siloed approach where you need to apply to a program. Departments are not being proactive in making communities aware in order to increase access to these programs. That's just not working. In housing, there's 2 decades worth of evidence to show you that it's not supporting the commitment. So I think policy just hasn't kept up with where everything's going. Self-determination isn't just about providing resources and funding a program. It's about also making sure that communities have the capacity and the skills to take over all of these programs. And I'd really like to see the government fundamentally change the way they're approaching funding Indigenous commitments.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but once again, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we'll have Jerry Swamp, the president of the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, to give us his thoughts on the auditor's report. You're watching Nation and Nation, and I'm Fraser Needham. The Auditor General's latest report on First Nations and Inuit policing program exposes a number of problems. The report finds $13 million allotted to the program went unspent last year, and this could balloon to $45 million by the end of this fiscal year. It also says the RCMP was funded to hire 467 officers under the Community Tripartite Program since 2018, but only 406 have actually been hired. That's a shortfall of 61 officers. Joining me today to talk about the Auditor General's report is Jerry Swamp. He's the president of the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, and he joins me from Rama, Ontario. Welcome back to Nation and Nation, Mr. Swamp.
Thank you for having me.
So now the report's been out for a few days, and you had a chance to read it. What's some of your initial thoughts?
My initial thought was, first I wanted to acknowledge and express appreciation for the Auditor General for the comprehensive examination of the First Nation and Inuit policing program. What's concerning to me right off the bat is that a lot of what was said in the audit by the Auditor General is the same things that have been said in the previous audits in 2014 and 2021, and then now 2024. The same issues have been raised in the same recommendations throughout all of these audits. And it's concerning that Public Safety Canada has agreed to all the recommendations for each one of the audits, yet there has been no changes made.
I thought I might follow up too on the fact that, of course, you've been involved with what's called self-administered policing agreements. I know there's been a lot of talk for First Nations moving towards that, a lot of interest. And it seems that the Community Tripartite program has a lot of problems. One, the report says that RCMP officers, as it is now, only 38% of communities are they able to actually meet the demands of that program. Of course, and there's a shortfall of even actually hiring the officers they've been funded toward. Is this just proof that maybe we should just be moving more towards self-administered policing?
Well, self-administered policing in First Nations, we have a different model of policing. We feel that we have a true community policing because 60% of our police officers are from the community that they serve. Most of us know our culture, most of us know our language and our history and our traditions. So our policing model reflects those how we police that model. And with the RCMP, I think they're struggling just the same way as every other police service in Canada is struggling in the retention and the recruitment process, especially recruiting First Nation police services. With the Truth and Reconciliation in the last few years, I know they've struggled for the recruiting of First Nations becoming officers in their police services. And it is daunting that in their CTA agreements, it says that they must comply with 100% of their hours working has to be in a First Nation community, yet they can only make 38% of that at the time. So I do empathize that recruiting is very hard. It's very hard for the young people to want to become a police officer in today's day and age. And that's the same for every other police services. We struggle. But I think the police officers that commit themselves to a long career within First Nation police services do it honorably, and they commit to us. There's a retention that I think our retention rate is well above the national averages.
Also, one of the things that the Public Safety Minister said when the report was released, and also it's in the actual report, is that Ottawa says that one of the reasons they haven't been able to distribute this money is the provinces have not been keeping their end of the agreement or been funding the program as they're supposed to. Is that what's your thoughts on that?
Well, the provinces, when the federal government gets money for this program, they blame it on the provinces and saying that they have to tell the provinces that they have to meet their 48% contribution to the program. Well, the provinces in Canada, they come up with unilateral agreements for grants for different policing functions in the provinces. How come Canada can't provide that unilateral agreements to the police services themselves without a contribution to from the provinces. So the provinces already do it. Why can't the feds do that? With the money that was unspent, like the $45 million that's projecting is going to be unspent this year, that's from the CTA side. That's not from the standalone police services side, because we've been arguing for many, many years that our side is unfunded. We represent 36 standalone police services in Canada, and we've been chronically unfunded for many, many years since the program started. If there's an excess of funding that hasn't been spent on the CTA side, how come they couldn't roll that over to the standalone police services side? I don't want to take away from any First Nation communities in Canada, specifically the ones that the RCMP are policing. But if the RCMP can't fulfill their mandates, how come they couldn't roll that over to the standalone police services side? I know this year I was going for my negotiations and we were told there is no additional resources and money available. Yet the auditor's general report comes out and says there's $45 million that was unspent they're projecting this year. And there's a many First Nation police services that are struggling. There's 3 police services in Ontario that had to go to get a court injunction for Public Safety Canada to negotiate with them in a meaningful way. Their negotiations are continuing right now, and it doesn't look like it's going to be fulfilled by the end of the fiscal year. Yet we have $45 million of Public Safety Canada that's going to have to go back to Treasury.
Right, and the Public Safety Minister also talked again about this sort of things will change when this First Nations police as an essential service legislation comes forward. I know there's been talk about that in the past. Are you able to give me an update? Have you heard anything on where things are with that?
Public Safety Canada has over the last month and a half pursued engagement sessions across Canada, and it's a last-ditch effort for them to get input from the communities, the police services, the leadership on the principles of what is going to be involved in this legislation. And I know there's been issues with some AFN, First Nation communities and leaderships in regards to jurisdiction of policing. That's a topic that's a political topic that needs to be discussed further. Public Safety Canada and AFN were mandated to co-development this legislation. And right now, Public Safety Canada is pursuing the principles on their own. They're looking to table this before government by late spring and hopeful that it will go to a legislation process by fall.
Okay, and maybe as a last question, I know that there's a number of lawsuits pending. The last time we talked about sort of fulfilling, or Ottawa fulfilling its mandate. Are you able to give us any update on that?
Some of the lawsuits were put in place in the human rights complaints process because of the issues that First Nation police services, communities, and leaderships have had with the particular program. We were limited in different areas, aspect of policing. In our First Nation communities across Canada that we police, we see an average of 37% higher violent crimes than the national or the provincial averages in our communities. Yet our First Nation police services aren't funded for specialized services. And it wasn't until we threatened litigation and we were a week before a court date that Public Safety Minister, by the stroke of his pen, relieved that condition under the terms and conditions of the FNIPP program, which allowed us to have specialized services. But then we turn around and have negotiations with Public Safety Canada, and they say there's no more money available for specialized services.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. But once again, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Up next, we'll take you to a press conference being held in Ottawa on the ongoing search for unmarked graves on the sites of former residential schools. Welcome back. It has been a very busy week in Ottawa. There are concerns being raised that looming government budget cuts may affect work being done in the ongoing search for unmarked graves on the sites of former residential schools. The International Commission on Missing Persons is the Netherlands-based organization that has been contracted by the federal government to assist in the search for unmarked graves. ICMP itself has faced criticism that it is not Indigenous-led, in spite of the fact Sheila North, a former Assembly of First Nations National Chief candidate, has signed on to assist with ICMP's work. We'll take you now to a press conference being held by the NDP, the Pimiskamak Cree Nation, Dene Nation, and ICMP. This is for the ICMP, seeing as the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, NCTR, and Special Interlocutor Kimberly Murray have all said you are not the appropriate organization to be doing this work. How do you expect survivors to see your work as credible?
I'll start. Thank you very much for the question, and very legitimate question. And I would say that it's the communities, it's Chief Monias and other chiefs that have asked for ICMP support. It's not that ICMP had, imposed their work on Canada or even First Nations. They have work around the world currently in all kinds of places that this work is being done right now in Ukraine and Mexico and all over the world. So, the criticisms and the concerns that came from the three organizations that you're talking about are of course legitimate in their own right, but at the same time, I don't believe we had an opportunity to properly address the concerns. We did welcome the amended statements and amendments to the work plan that was initially signed under the technical arrangement between CERNAC and ICMP, but we have not, in a constructive way, been able to properly talk about the concerns, and this has hindered the work that we were able to do and what we wanted to do in support of Chief Monias and other nations, and ultimately trying to find answers to what happened to these children. So I believe that we still need an opportunity. I'm looking forward. My hand extends out to these three organizations constantly, and the door open to talk about a way forward so that we can all work together in support of nations that are seeking answers, as my friend Chief Antoine has eloquently put, because ultimately this is about children, and I hope that we can move forward in a better way as we go, because this is important work, and I'm here as a willing partner to help with that. Catherine?
I can only underscore what my amazing colleague Sheila has already said, and just add, we need all hands on deck. Everyone needs to cooperate to ensure that this strategy is implemented and that there's goodwill towards all communities. As Sheila said, we look forward to working with everyone. Division only, I think regretfully, adds to the emotional distress of families of the missing, so uniting and ensuring that everyone works together peacefully to ensure that survivors can assert their rights is critical. So we welcome any kind of dialogue. We welcome working with absolutely everyone. We need to do that together.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.